It's certainly how Beijing would like it to work. Their hope is that they can show enough military muscle and that they can rattle the saber sufficiently to cower the people of Taiwan ultimately into submission, to make them feel that they're in a hopeless situation and they have no choice but to surrender their freedom, their sovereignty over time. And also to convince Americans that we're also outgunned, that we could lose if we come to Taiwan's defense. And even if we won, the cost and the risks, including the risk of a potential nuclear exchange, would be so horrendous that we wouldn't dare do it in the first place. That's their political warfare.
Just what is the significance of the recent Taiwan elections, with President Tsai Ing-wen, the incumbent, winning by a landslide? Why is Taiwan critical to the power balance in Asia? In what ways has the Chinese Communist Party engaged in information warfare against Taiwan? How is the Chinese regime using similar tactics across the globe? And why is the Chinese Communist regime fixated on conquering Taiwan? And how has the People's Liberation Army been gearing up for this? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek.